Welcome to the Schumacher Center for New Economics Conversations. Thank you so much for your patience as we figured out the technology of Zoom. My name is Jodie Evans, and I'm the co-founder of Code Pink Women for Peace, and I sit on the Schumacher board, and so have been asked to moderate this conversation today. I'm so excited to talk to these two old white guys who have spent their lives teaching us about the perils of inequality to democracy, about the need for resilience, and what life needs to flourish, and how we must engage locally in our communities. The Schumacher Lectures have featured some of the best thinker activists over the past 4 decades. And Gar Alperovitz and John L. McKnight are two who go way back and have not stopped thinking, inspiring, and leading the way. I call them the Pied Pipers to the world of well-being. We're going to talk for a while, and you will be able to ask questions. Please put them in the Q&A. The chat will be disabled. John goes back to 1984. He was our 4th lecture, and Gar 1994, the 14th, and again in 2011, our 31st. John is the co-director of the ABC Institute, Asset-Based Community Development, and Professor Emeritus of Communication Studies in Education and Social Policy at Northwestern University. He has authored and co-authored books, Building Communities from the Inside Out, The Careless Society, and The Abundant Community. He also co-founded the Gamaliel Foundation to train national organizers. One of them was President Barack Obama. And he's also a founding board member of National Peace Action. And you can read his blog at Abundant Community. Gar is a historian, political economist, activist, writer, teacher, and former government official. He worked in Senator Gaylord Nelson's office, who founded Earth Day. Gar is the president of the National Center for Economic and Security Alternatives and is the founder of the Democracy Collective. He was a founding board member of the New Economy Coalition and currently the co-chair of the Next System Project. He too has authored and co-authored numerous books. What Then Must We Do? America Beyond Capitalism, Making a Place for Community. The Decision to Use the Atomic Bomb and the Architecture of an American Myth, and Rebuilding America. He never stops organizing political power to constrain the corporate system. John, I want to start with you. Your lecture in 1984 called us to be good friends and neighbors, and that acts of human kindness enrich our multiple lives together. Basically, you spoke to what is essential all those years ago, something many are waking up to today. Where are you right now, and what has changed for you in these 36 years?
Well, I'm glad to be here. I was a friend of Bob Schwann, who was a founder, I think, of the Schumacher Society. And so it's good also that we can remember him and all of the contributions that he made. When I made the presentation all those years ago, I called it John Deere and the Bereavement Counselor, sort of strange juxtaposition. But what I was trying to do was to look at what are the factors that decay the power of communities to become the center of society and the creators and problem solvers. And when I say community, I mean, I think locally. I'm a neighborhoodista. And so the point of the article was that John Deere figured out a way to break up the prairie. When the settlers got to the Midwest, there was nothing but prairie. Here, let me, and that prairie couldn't be cultivated because it was covered with heavy grass. And so what John Deere did is he developed the first steel plow. And that steel plow allowed them to bust up the prairie, to break up the prairie, to cut apart the natural world, right? And they call it the sod buster, and he introduced the possibility of monocropping, a tool that could produce lots of goods, lots of products, but that ruined the soil in the process. So it was a tool that took the physical world, broke it up, and made it decay. And then I was saying the same thing, is happening in terms of the professions. And at the particular time, I was taken by bereavement counselors who had a method to come in and help you when somebody close by died. And I pointed out that what they did was what John Deere did to the soil, they did to the community and its capacity, because they replaced the community's culture and capacity to grieve together, to console together, to repair together. And the point was that there are physical tools that can tear up the world we need to support decent living. And it can tear up the social world that we're engaged in as well. Now, one way that you see that manifested is that functions in local communities slowly have left and migrated into institutions. And institutions are like bereavement counselors and like John Deere's plow. They take over the community's functions and leave it arid and unproductive. And so that process was very clear at the time of the lecture. I think it is still going on. So that most neighborhoods and local places are largely bereft of the capacity to create or to solve problems because their functions have been taken over by the institutions in the society. And the way that looks is that schools are where education is, not in a community. So the idea that it takes a village to raise a child has gotten lost. Locally, where are the villages raising the children? But schools. So we transferred the community's propagation possibility over to the schools. We've given up our capacity to create secure communities out of our relationships, given it up to the police. We've given up our healthful activities and given it up to the medical profession. And the list goes on, but those are three good examples of the kinds of institutions that have taken over community functions. So Schumacher said, small is beautiful, but the small and the local, my lecture was trying to say, is becoming bereft. And it's bereft because it doesn't have any real functions to perform. Instead, those functions have all been transferred over to the world of professions and consumption. And we are left usually without any of the powers locally of being a citizen, the producer of the future. And instead, we are better called consumers or clients. Now, I don't want to be hopeless about this. And so let me mention a couple things that I think are going on now that are a little different than the past and that are hopeful. And the first is that the top professionals in the major systems that concern community all now recognize the limits of what they can do. So if you talk to a police chief, a smart police chief, he'll say, we've done everything we can to deal with crime, but the problem is the community isn't doing its part. And schools are saying, we're good, we're professionals, we do well, but the trouble is the communities are sending us kids who aren't prepared to learn and they aren't supporting. And the people in health, I think who are clearest about this, are saying, we account in the medical field for about 15% of people's well-being, and the other 85% is in the community. So it's very hopeful here that these institutional leaders have finally recognized how much of our well-being grows out of what we can do locally. But I don't think they often recognize that the reason we can't do it locally is that they've said we can do it better. Buy it from us. Don't be a productive community. The second thing that I think is happening is very hopeful is that there are movements abroad now that recognize that we've got to do something to restore the capacity of citizen space, the local community. And one of the most vivid that you can see right now is the result of the Black Lives Matter movement. And here you hear people say, let's defund this institution called police. Let's rethink this institution called police. And almost immediately, if you follow those discussions, and they're going on in almost every city of any consequence, what they're doing first is they say, the police have more functions than they could possibly perform. We got to relocate those functions. And so I call that refunctioning. And the question for us right now is, can we transfer functions to communities as well as other institutions? That's the real. And if we end up just transferring them to other institutions, I think we will see the phenomena of overload. That once the institutions will begin to cry, you're asking us to do too much. You're asking us to do too much. So right now, I think in thinking about the police, there's a way of saying, the real question here is the police. The real question is who performs what functions. And I think our ABCD Institute would say, and start with a presumption that you ought to ask, what can people in a neighborhood do about the production of security? Don't just think, how can we transfer from police functions to social workers and psychiatrists and psychologists, right? So I think it's very hopeful that we are seeing movements to rethink the functions of institutions, and particularly the roles that neighborhoods and local communities can, ought to, and are the only ones can really perform them. So I have 4 quick ideas that go with this. The question is, who is the producer of well-being? And what is the local neighborhood as a source of well-being? Who produces it? And if the neighborhood produces nothing, then the people who live there will be absolutely and of necessity consumers and clients. The second thing is that small does not carry much weight in the minds of institutional professionals. Small isn't beautiful. Big is beautiful. System change is beautiful, right? But small, I think, is being rediscovered. And the real thing that's being discovered is small is functional, right? As well as beautiful. The third thing is that I think a lot of people have come to understand, do not think about reform. I think our institutions have reached the level of development where reform is not really going to get us anyplace. Think refunctioning. How can we not get bigger police departments and bigger medical systems? But how can we look at what they have taken over from community life and refunction it back in the community? And that's the movement that we're associated with. Finally, the way you will know when this refunctioning takes place is that local people will be able to produce a set of relationships and productivity that will make a culture. They will begin to fashion their way, our culture, and move away from the institutional culture that says you buy your well-being, right? And that's big is beautiful. But I think people are coming to see now that small is beautiful because the big things just aren't working and can't be reformed. So that's.
Thank you, John. That was beautiful.
Well,
So Gar, your lecture in 1984 warned of how technology would increase the gap between the rich and poor, and attention had to be paid for a more equal distribution of wealth, or the well-being of the majority would suffer. So you too were prescient, and sadly prescient. How has the world changed since your lecture, and what are you thinking about today? And also, I had asked John, but like, where are you? Just so like we can set you, in space and time. What state, city?
Go ahead, John.
I'm in a little town in Wisconsin with a lovely name, Spring Green.
Oh, that's where Taliesin is?
That's where I'm on the other side of the river from Taliesin. Yeah.
Taliesin is the home of the architect Frank Lloyd Wright, which I visited once with him long ago when I was a student at the University of Wisconsin. I'm from Wisconsin originally. I'm from a community, John. I'm from Racine, Wisconsin.
Right.
It actually was a community when I was there in the way that you talk about it. So I know what you're talking about. So how have my thoughts changed?
Tell us where you are.
Oh, I'm in Washington, D.C.
Okay.
Locked up in the house, keeping away from the virus. My wife and I have been getting a little stir crazy, but I've been writing a book, so it hasn't changed my life much. I've been sitting, almost finished the book.
Cool.
So that's where I am.
Thank you.
So I start with, let me just say that I affirm and accept and applaud John's emphasis on community, and particularly in the way he describes it. And Paul Goodman was a good friend of mine way back when, who had a similar view and beginning there, and that's Racine, Wisconsin. I love to tell my elephant story about Racine. The zoo in Racine was about 70,000 people. They couldn't afford an elephant at the zoo. So they put up a big bucket and a sign. And after a while, the community contributed nickels and dimes and dollars and whatever. And they finally got their elephant, which is kind of my picture of Racine, Wisconsin. That said, I worked in many, many communities. I worked in Youngstown, Ohio, which is probably the classic one to talk about. And the big industry there was the steel industry. And they closed down the Youngstown Sheet and Tube steel mill. and they devastated what was left of community. So that you cannot only be at the community level, because the larger economic forces are so powerful that they can destroy everything that John and I are, what I grew up with and what John's talking about. And that's a really big problem, because it requires you simultaneously to build from the bottom and simultaneously to think about big political economic systems. Schumacher was very clear about this. Who Small is Beautiful was the name that his publisher suggested to him for his book, which he accepted. But Schumacher was a socialist. He believed in socializing the big industry. He didn't think you could do Small is Beautiful without being a socialist. And people don't really remember that about Schumacher, because the vision he gave us was a much more localist and appropriate technology. But when he talked about appropriate technology, he started at the bottom, but some things like big steel mills, or maybe had to go to larger scale ownership and control, and he was a socialist. So putting those pieces together, I wrote a book called Making a Place for, with Thad Williamson, Making a Place for Community as one part of this. How do you actually, and I think we've begun to see this with what Bernie Sanders has done and the Democratic Socialist movement and the rise of climate change and the national movement, how do you actually think about a political economic system as a whole that would prioritize, that would begin with and prioritize the reconstruction of democratic community and democratic community culture? What would that system look like? Starting always with community. One of the people I was very interested in, I'm sure John was, Martin Buber started at community as well. The I-thou could not exist without a cooperative community. And he's a great teacher of many, and certainly one of my heroes in that way. But that requires, you know, it's a very simple thing to say, but it requires national economic planning to stabilize communities. Otherwise, they get thrown away, like Youngstown, and to a certain degree, Racine, and many parts of the country, the Rust Belt, or regional planning. It requires large order politics to control those large order things. And more important, it requires you to think about, if you want to think about it, can you do it with big corporations because they have so much political power? And so it begins forcing you into questions about how you have some form of democratic ownership, starting at the neighborhood, then to the city, municipal utilities for neighborhood ownership. There are many neighborhood-owned businesses around the country. We can talk about them in different parts of the country. Cleveland right now is a good example. Preston is a good example. Many cities have the old community development corporations, some of which in the old days owned businesses for the community, and some still do. Mainly, most of them are just housing and small business enterprise, but some of them were community builders. And then going to the larger scale states, there are state public banks, for instance, in North Dakota, a 100-year-old state-owned public bank to support communities. There are regional structures, the Tennessee Valley Authority, and there are public enterprises of various kinds. The big corporations have big public banks to finance international trade for them. Mainly Boeing would not exist without a national public bank and the Export-Import Bank. That they wanted it and they got it. The same is true in many industries. So if you begin asking, what would it take, and this, as I say, the book was Making a Place for Community, what would it take to really begin at the bottom and then build a system that would actually stabilize, encourage, and nurture all the way up community, starting with community? And let me emphasize, you cannot have democracy, in my view, genuine democracy, strong democracy, what the late Benjamin Barber called strong democracy, unless you have democracy at the bottom up every day in everyday life, because that's where the culture is built. So what would a system look like overall that started with community and then built its way up through taking, including lots of small co-ops and private business at the local level, but whenever necessary, like the Tennessee Valley Authority, public ownership, state public banks, what would be necessary? What is the least that is necessary to make public in order to stabilize and make a place for community? So that's kind of where I began to develop. And over the last 20 years, particularly, the Democracy Collaborative, an organization that Ted Howard and I started and is now working on, is trying to flesh out what that actually means, and simultaneously to trying to create a serious dialogue and intellectual debate about, if you don't like capitalism and you don't like state socialism, what do you want? And so we've been publishing paper. Gus Speth, my partner in this on the intellectual side, is about to publish a book of 40 or 50 essays we've commissioned over the last 20 years, people debating, just like the committees of correspondence, where do we go beyond state socialism, beyond corporate capitalism? What does it really look like? How do we think heavily about community? How do we think about regions? What can be local, what can be state, what can be national? And having that as a genuine debate, just like the Articles of Confederation and the debate of the Constitution. And also, what can you do to begin to build economically as well? So some of you know about the Evergreen organization in Cleveland. It's a community-wide corporation, nonprofit, which owns businesses, about 500 employees in the community, but it's community worker ownership. And similarly, a model in Preston, England, we've had something to do with much bigger and broader, where there's community, but community ownership as well to stabilize the jobs and give people participatory ownership. And the public banking movement, which is going on around the country, beginning to try to get state banks. They think the next one may be either New Jersey or Washington State, in addition to North Dakota, which has been there so long. And there's discussion in California as well. And part of it also, in a continental system, here's a question for you and for our folks listening in to answer. How do you have participatory democracy in a system that is a continental system, 3,000 miles corner to corner, with moving towards 300 million, 400 million people, 400 million people we're moving towards? Tell me how we have participatory democracy in such a giant system. You can drop Germany into Wyoming. Those are tiny, France will easily fit in Texas. We have no idea of our scale and what that does to democracy. So one of the larger questions that we all need to face is how we think about regions, how we begin to look at regional development in a different way over this coming period. So there are lots of really big questions. It's like the time of the Constitution and the Articles of Confederation, really thinking about beyond the current moment of Mr. Trump and his problems and difficulties. Where do we go? And the beauty is that there's a movement. There are large movements that are beginning to build and asking these kinds of questions in seriousness, starting at the community, working their way up, always thinking about all these, but also debating the big questions. So that's what's changed a lot, to answer your question. Over time, I've been thinking a lot about it. And I've also been thinking, and I'll be interested in, we can get into this more, here's a particular problem that we face, and it's a genuine, which most people haven't thought, I think, enough about. The basis of the democratic, liberal, progressive politics institutionally, in all of the advanced political economic systems, was organized labor. Labor unions were critical to progressive political movements, liberalism. American labor movements have been crushed by technology and by the right wing and by the corporations. They are down to 6% of the labor force in the private sector and going down. Last time I looked, it was 10 to 11% overall and going down. It used to be 34%. In Sweden, the great Swedish welfare state, was 80% labor union-based politics. Well, that's over. So rebuilding from the, I think, and here's where John and I probably come very strongly together, we'll see, John. I think the reconstruction of a politics from the bottom up, community by community, including ownership structures, is going to be the only way to replace what we had in the social democratic liberal movements, to empower and undergird, and also keep in line, keep communitizing a national politics. That's the place to begin, but not to forget about what you have to do at the national and regional level. So it's been a long and interesting kind of developmental trend. It started with community and people like Martin Buber and Schumacher, But it led me to these kinds of questions. And so I've been trying to see, what does the system look like, and what are the politics of that system? How do you deal with the continent if you start with community? And how do you deal with large technology if you start with community? Tough questions, but they're not mine, they're ours.
Thank you, Gar. That's so beautiful. The small and the big that do have to exist together, and that you both come at it from the community as the root. And also the thing you've both mentioned is culture. You know, one of the conversations you and I've had is that thing of, you know, you talk about the big, and I'm like, how does a person enter this? Like the person listening today, how do they enter this conversation? Because we do get distracted by the big. Everybody gets distracted by a presidential election. But if you're distracted by the presidential election and not engaged in creating a culture of relationship locally, how do you even, you know, like you're not creating the soil for what you're talking about. And so what would you say to the people listening about what could they do right now to affect the culture so that those questions you're talking about can be answered for the well-being of all, instead of the increase in wealth of corporations?
Well, the Chinese have an expression that which I kind of like, and I probably misapply it, but they say anything that's serious has to walk on two legs. You have to do two things at once. I think the place, you have to start locally, but you also have to think about systems. You really have to do both. If you go one way or the other, you lose. And I also think the place to start is, and I often say this in talks and lectures and in seminars, I think to go back to here, I'm going to give you my age. You know my age roughly by looking at my hair. Back in the
It's okay that I called you an old white guy.
right. Back in the people who taught us a good deal about this were the women's movement in the early days. And what did they do in the early days? Often what they do is they would get together, they'd get some pizza and something, 5 or 6 women in the neighborhood, get some pizza, maybe something to drink, hard or soft, whatever. And they'd read something, and then they'd talk to each other about what they'd read, really beyond just going out and marching, which you had to do too, and the petitions, which you had to do too, and all of it. And they'd think about it, and they'd debate what to do, and then they say, well, let's go try a project. And asking the question that we're now talking about, how do you build community, and how do you also deal with the system problem? Now, the feminist movement has done pretty well on that front, because they've gone from local to national all the way, and there's still more to do, but that's a kind of a good model. You can't do it all locally, not in a 350 million people or 340, whatever the number is, moving towards 400. And you better do it local, or you haven't got anything. You haven't got a culture, and you haven't got a meaningful culture. You know, the technology is so rich now, not just the communications technology, but if we were to divide up the national income right now, currently, every family of 4 would have about $250,000 or $125,000 a year income and a 20-hour week. It is a very, very rich economy. Now, the distribution of income doesn't allow that. But one of the ways to think about the future is the technology is permissive for the first time in world history. It's permissive for a very great amount of free time to build community. But that requires managing the system in a way that allocates money and time, above all time and security, jobs that are secure in communities, for really constructing all the things that John's talking about and that I would talk about, rebuilding a culture of community from the bottom up. But the technology permits that. We are a rich society.
So, I mean, I want to go back to your pointing to the women and talk about co-option, because the feminist movement has also been co-opted.
Yeah.
And so, and go back to, you know, the communities you said that were destroyed by the big. And so I look at it through a lens, because I'm a peace activist, of there's a war economy. I'm not going to end war till I can end the war economy, because it's serving the war economy. And there's a peace economy. And the peace economy to me is the giving, sharing, caring, thriving, relational, resilient economy without which none of us would be alive.
Right.
But we still, for some reason, haven't been able to understand that you know, it's kind of like Don was saying, is like, the police aren't making life or safety or security. That's for us to do, but we projected on something bigger. And how, you know, you've done so much work and you've created these, you know, organizations where you teach and you help us understand the patterns we're in, but they're still inside of the structure that creates that inequality that you're talking about. And so, yes, the technology is available, but the technology is also sweeping, you know, that you warned about in your first lecture, is like sweeping the money even more to fewer and fewer people. I mean, it's got to be, you know, historic. Like the level of inequality is profound. And I think we're seeing that in the streets. That, you know, why is there so much outrage, is that nothing is serving the people. It's serving so few. And so you're talking about a conundrum, because there still is this fierce structure of capitalism and greed and commodification of all that is beautiful.
Well, that's, I don't disagree with anything you said. I mean, the whole point of what a lot of the last 2 to 3 books I've written, but also at the Democracy Collaborative, we have something called the Next System Project, not just the Localist Project. I don't think you get there without socializing or making public the large industries and make them community, worker, national, or regional, like the Tennessee Valley. I don't think you can do it because the corporations have too much political as well as economic power. But then what is a vision? You don't want state socialism, because that concentrates it in the hands of the bureaucrats and the big economic. So a lot of what I've written a lot about is precisely the question you're asking. How do you build decentralizing as much as you can? What must be at the state level, like the Public Bank of North Dakota or many other states? What could you go to regions like the Tennessee Valley Authority, which is public ownership? What would be national? And asking those questions, not rhetorically, but what really do we want? What would really nurture community, and what has to go to larger scale? Those are genuine questions. So there's I guess one of the things that I think a lot about, how do we engender a conversation about, and indeed we spent a lot of time at the Democracy Collaborative on just this question, on just the question you asked. If you can't do it with corporate cop power, and you don't like state socialism, and you start with community, what does that system look like that nurtures from the bottom up, but still deals with large technology? That's a genuine set of idea questions. I think, you know, I can't remember the philosopher who said it, ideas don't matter much in history, except sometimes, when we're running out of ideas about what to do about the big system. So you've got a good movement needs to answer all those questions. Otherwise, it's bereft, or as a friend of mine says, they'll beat you at the pass. When you get down to the corner, the other side's asked that question and they'll beat you. So you better ask just what you say. What do you do about the big stuff? What do you do about economics as well? So,
well, I think we have that coming from the movement for Black Lives. I hear there's about a 47-page breathe movement of like that tries to answer in a full way some of these questions.
And the climate change movement is asking the same questions, and the Democracy Collaborative has a huge debate going on about that. Many people fighting over these questions, and a book is about to come out, summarize 30 or 40 essays on just this question. We need a huge national discussion of all this.
There's a question from the audience. The American brand of capitalism, perhaps even American culture itself, has always seemed to depend upon an underclass. Do you think a post-organized labor community building model can work without having to identify an other, against which all will band together in solidarity.
I hope so. But I do think that is the possibility that is offered in this time. As I said, the technology is for the first, and let me just underscore this. The technological wealth of this system and the advanced system, for the very first time in history, is such that we could easily have a culture that gave very generous incomes to everybody and a lot of free time to build community simultaneously. So yes, the culture and the technology is permissive, and I don't think you need an underclass. I think that we could build a genuinely egalitarian and community culture if that were our goal over. Now, if you want to play this game, I sometimes say, if you want to play this game, of course, you better throw 30 or 40 years of your life on the table. You're talking about transforming the largest political, economic system in the history of the world, the most powerful one in any case. So you've got to build from the bottom, but also deal with the top. And that's the name of the game. But I think there's a movement that's building up that I think is beginning to ask the right questions. If we can now begin to have more and more debate and clarity about how we do it from just where John is starting and go all the way up to the larger regional and national economic questions that Schumacher also dealt with, I think we've got a shot. And I think this is a very powerful moment in American history, laying groundwork to open these doors and moving beyond the current person who sits in, I'm going to say, I can't call him president, the man who sits in the White House. The person who sits in the White
I think
House.
both you and John are that inspiration, because you both have, you're just doing it and you're in it. And so did you know when you started that it was a 50-year fight? Did you understand that when you started?
Yeah, that is one of the questions. You got to throw a few decades of your life on the table to play the game. I started out as a historian, but then I looked at what it was like to be an academic. I was up at Harvard, and I said, I don't want to do that game. And so I began to say, well, invent it and do these are the things I care about. So, if that's what you care about, then you find a way.
So we've been talking about, really what you talked about, that at the core, we have to change culture, because even to get to where Gar wants to go, there has to be that culture that wants that desires that, will fight for it, and even understands the need for it and what the benefits of it are. So you heard Gar talk about the big. How do you see that in relationship to your connection to small and local, and how do you navigate the big?
Incidentally, I do want to say that when Gar brought up the union movement, I said in several settings that whatever is appropriate that achieves that end, I think is central. I think it was more, the government had a lot to do with whether it could prosper. But I think associational life in unions is a collective economic activity that is itself a pedagogy and a source of power. So I really do believe that's a critical issue these days. So getting back to your question, I really do spend a lot of time thinking small, and been very interested in a block, 2 blocks, 3 blocks. How might you begin the creation of a local culture? And we've experimented with several approaches, and the one I think that appears to be the most successful is to assume that what will pull people together. I was an Alinsky organizer for 20 years, and there we thought what would pull people together is join them around what they were mutually angry about, right? And that's good. I mean, that's issue organizing. But for culture building, I don't think it necessarily had much of that effect. So I think we have thought that a very important point of beginning is to assume that everybody on a block or in a neighborhood has the potential to be collectively powerful. And how can we get them to be connected around what they have in terms of their own abilities, skills, things they know, so that they have the experience of creating something and seeing that there is power in this collective small group. And the most common way from an ABC perspective that happens is that on a block, people begin by asking door by door, their neighbors, can you tell us what is your most significant skill? What is your greatest passion? What do you know well enough that you could teach it? What is your most significant gift? And then, would you be willing to share this? And so 90% of the people will. So what you have is the beginnings of self-defined motives to act. And the connective process, the collectivization at the very local level, we think people called connectors do that, is a way that gets more benefits in moving people forward in a sense of their being creators. That creation builds power, and it comes from being collective. So we're experience-based in that sense around what people have to contribute and form associations around those things that they mutually share and want to pursue. So that's the rudiments of the kind of thing that we've been involved in. And there's actually one city where they are trying to achieve this in every single block, and it's Edmonton, Canada. And if anybody's interested, you could go to the internet and look under the Abundant Community Initiative, Edmonton, Canada. And it's brought that city's localities into locally collective activities that has renewed the city in a way I haven't seen in other cities.
We all need some hope, so thank you for pointing that out. Someone in the audience wants to ask you, John, do you see transferring functions as a transfer of power? And if so, is it possible, and what are some examples of doing so?
Of the transfer of functions, right.
So if functions are actually the transfer of power.
Yeah. Well, let me give you an example from a couple of neighborhoods. If you ask everybody on a block what they know well enough that they would be willing to share it with young people on the block, right? You will find almost everybody has something, and on average, people will tell you 3 things. So if you had 30 households in a block, and at least one adult had 3 things that they knew that they would share with young people, that's a curriculum on that block of 90 subjects. Now, unless we are organized and see our own capacities, it just sits there. And we're these pitiable characters who live locally and depend upon a school to raise our children. Isn't that sad? So when those people then begin to put together, and the kids put together with what they know, right, you begin to grow the neighborhood sense that it has the power, right, to raise its children. And so that's one particular example I mean, and it's a total, it's an approach to refunctioning as well. Do you see? It's so if you begin to think about refunctioning and you ask yourself, what are the capacities we have? And you identify them and connect them and create new collective activities where people experience, I did this, I made this, and we did it together. That seems to me the nucleus, the atom for all the molecular stuff that we like to have happening, like unions. Right?
So basically, what you've said is, in both in a way, is that we've given away our power. That's, I mean, given it away, it's been taken away, but really we've given it away for simplicity, for ease, for safety, for security. And
All,
you're giving us a way to get back that power. And then it, as you get it, it can rise to the place where we can affect the refunctioning of the system that Gar was talking about. So I'm wondering if each of you have a question for the other. John, is there a question you've always wanted to ask Gar?
well, like, since this is a Schumacher Society discussion, Gar, at least I don't know how Schumacher felt about this, but who I really dealt with was Bob Swan. And Bob, of course, was very much interested in getting local currencies. Seems to me it's a way of thinking, how can I monetarily detach myself from the larger economy and its ups and downs? So local currency is, it seems to me, possibly a way of pulling out of the larger economy. And I wonder if you could reflect on, maybe I'm wrong, but reflect on where that part of the Schumacher Society fits in your thinking.
So I favor local currencies. I think they're very useful and very powerful, and I think the Schumacher Center has done a lot with them in a very creative way. And Susan particularly should be credited for the work she's done in creating the local currencies. But I don't think, what I think is really a problem and a challenge. I do not think you can abstract from the larger system. And I think there is a way to go local and not take account of the larger political economic system. And I think that's one of the dangers of that way of thinking about it, even though I'm a localist. I begin with community. I'm from Racine. If we can't do it, if Racine doesn't work, the system doesn't work.
It'll work, right?
That's how I think about it. I go back home and see my old buddies from high school, and it's either got to work here or it ain't going to work.
Yeah, right.
But we live in a political economic system of moving towards 400 million people, and a gross domestic product that's producing $250,000 for each family of four already, and shortly will be $400,000, radically maldistributed, producing unemployment, moving jobs in and out of communities, destroying the Youngstown, destroying the Racines. You cannot avoid the larger questions. So it's I don't think we can do only the reconstruction of community, though it is essential and ground zero. You've got to start there. There is simultaneously a need to be national and political citizens. How do we think about changing the system in a pragmatic, thoughtful, political building way to achieve what we want to achieve in the local community? Otherwise, they get you when you get to the pass, and they pull the jobs out from under you. And you say, oh, well, that was interesting. We forgot about that, and they've taken all the jobs away. Where are all my neighbors? And you know what happened in Youngstown with all the neighbors? Lots of the guys who lost their jobs went out in the garage and shot themselves because there was no alternative. So I think it's our responsibility to think about the systemic design, starting with community, that would nurture the reconstruction from the bottom up of a political economy.
Yeah.
What's on our side is technology. It's going to permit very, very powerful changes if we are able to put it together. The technology is very helpful to us if we do it the right way.
I'm with you on that, absolutely. But at least out of the group that we've created, we don't have a silver bullet. We have a way of restoring the productive capacity of collective work of people in a local place.
Right.
And that's a piece of it. I've never said it's a silver bullet. So I'm very interested in the larger scale. Let me ask you in that sense, I have an old friend who is an elected official. And a couple of years ago, I was talking with him and he said, the thing that bothers me the most is when I was a young politician, we could do things. He was talking about the latter part of the New Deal. We could do things because the economy had some boundary to it. And our use of public power could shape that economy. He says, I don't know what to do now. It's so internationalizes economy. I don't know what even the national handholds are on it. And so he said, despaired. It's out of control. I don't even know how to deal with an internationalized economy. You have a thought on that?
John, I've written 4 books on that subject.
Okay. Name them, and then you won't have to answer the question.
No, but starting with community.
Yeah.
Starting with community. One of the books is called "Making a Place for Community," and looking at the economy from the point of view of community. Right. And another one is "Rebuilding America," and I'm not going to give you my list, but if you ask that question in a serious citizen way, what do we need to do at the local level? What do we need to do at the next level? Yeah. But not go further. If you can do it at the state level, do it there because it's closer to the ground. And what must be done at the regional? Then you begin to sketch how a largely public controlled economy, Tennessee Valley Authority is an American approximation. It's kind of a public regional authority, beginning to sketch out. It's like the Articles of Confederation, the constitutional debate. We need that kind of in-depth citizen and scholarly debate. What does it look like if you start with community? And what do we do about the big stuff that you need? I often say in the lecture, people who go small is beautiful. Schumacher said appropriate technology.
Yeah, right.
Which means big stuff as well as little. But I asked how many people came here by airplane? And of course, half the crowd in the big national meeting. I'd say, who built the airplane? And can you do that in your neighborhood? No. So how do we control all of these pieces in a democratic economy? So you've got to start with locality and community. If you don't start there, you're lost. I totally agree with John. But if you don't think about the design that would nurture and support that system, and then build a politics around it, they'll wipe you away. They'll meet you at the pass and undercut the communities. That's the dilemma. But I think that's where we need to debate. I think that debate is beginning. I think Bernie Sanders opened that discussion. I think this emerging period of history, local work, the student work, the social democratic socialist work, the environmental, the climate change, the feminist part, the race issues, opening up a space for a really big debate and a big politics over this time. So I think we're in a very tough spot with the current occupant of the White House. I didn't say any more that he occupies that. But the period we're entering, I think, is really a time of having this discussion in a big way, not just here, but throughout. How do you start local, and then what are the requirements in the national? How do we make it work all the way through the system?
Yeah, and I think I'm saying the piece of it at the most local level that is hopeful to me is what we call refunctioning, rethinking where in the society should the power to fulfill certain functions be. And I think you have thought beautifully and constantly about the economic side of that question. And I really want to honor you for that, because I don't think I've been fortunate enough to have you thinking about that.
In terms of honoring, vice versa. John, let's go on. Let's go on. Sing duets together.
I think you are, and it's a beautiful harmony.
Yeah.
Gar, do you have a question for John?
Well, I was going to ask John a question that feeds into that I keep struggling with from Racine and from Youngstown. John, how do you think about the Youngstown story is so tragic but so common. When the national economy and the corporations pull the rug out from under the community, all the people who are in the block, not all of them, but many of them disperse.
First.
So how do you think about at the local level beginning a dialogue that allows a national politics also?
Yeah.
The feminists face this in a different way.
Right. You're asking me your question that I'd ask you.
Yeah.
So I'm not, I haven't bent my mind in a very useful way that I think I've seen and worked in as a neighborhood organizer, neighborhoods that were deindustrializing. So I'm very much aware of the consequence of that kind of activity. And then, you know, there was the movement to have the workers take over the organization, and the ESOP approach, the kinds of approaches that say we need these kinds of structures and economic elements. So we ought to have local ownership from the workers themselves, and sometimes from local residents. I had great hope in that. I'm not sure, so I'm turning the question to you. I'm not sure that worked too well. I don't see many. I remember when, you know, and the Monongahela experiment, when we were thinking that the workers could take over and run the steel mills. So that's what, out of my experience, I saw as the first step. Well, maybe we can do this ourselves. And I think there are some co-ops where that has worked, but generally it didn't deal with the deindustrialization, did it?
No, I think.
And why?
Because, well, it's really these are the kinds of questions we all need to get into. I love this because it's not your problem or my problem, it's our problem. How do you organize an advanced political economic system? That's the question. It's really implicit in that, because it requires some form, whatever I'm going to use a dirty word. It requires some form of planning, whether you call it that or not, that somehow to replace jobs as they go out, as new technologies come in. The new technologies eliminate jobs. You better have a thought about how to replace them. What is the new direction? How do you allocate that? So some part of it is how we develop actual plans for this in a democratic way. And we do it all the time. The tax system is a planning system, and it basically favors the corporations. There are many government programs, legislation, they don't call it planning, but if you look at the healthcare system, the way in which the corporations and the hospitals and insurance companies run it is a planning system for them with government support. So we're going to have to develop, and Schumacher got to this, and he got to this point. Schumacher believed small is beautiful, but when necessary, you had to go to public ownership and planning. And he was very clear about it in his many discussions, and in part 4 of Small is Beautiful. You cannot go only local. So it's like the Articles of Confederation and the Constitution. It's time for this big debate that you and I are poking around the edges of, John, for a national debate about really how do you do this? How do we all do this?
Didn't Jefferson say we needed to do this every 4 years, and we're just really like far away from 4 years?
Yeah, it's the right time. It's be a good time to be born, John.
So, Gar, directed at you. Could you talk about the internationalist lens of your pluralistic Commonwealth conception? How do we overcome the assumption that we need to argue for democratic economy as a means of countering China, or building US hegemony in the 21st century?
Oh. Well, it's you touch on a subject that pretty close to my heart. As you know, we are approaching the 75th anniversary of the bombing of Hiroshima. I've written 2 big books on how that was unnecessary and known to be unnecessary by all of the players. The Japanese were trying to surrender. There's a whole, so the international, I started my work on what drove me local, started international. How did, because you end up with nuclear wars. So the reconstruction of the system from the bottom up, to me, is also how you deal with the problem of a peace culture that doesn't depend on weapons and all of the planning systems that provide jobs and as well as the locals and the culture. So I think the only way to do this, think about it even, is the rebuilding for Americans of what we have here in a democratic way and a culturally generous way, and a way that pulls back the forms of power and repression and militarism, reducing our role in some of the most horrendous support of some outrageous people abroad, simultaneously, but building a culture that would support a very different foreign policy. And also an example in our own lives of changing the system that begins to generate a different foreign policy. The problem with our foreign policy is us. That is, unless we change, they will run that. In paying for my sins, at one point I was a high State Department official, and I worked in the Senate long ago when I was more black hair than I now have. I've seen it from the inside. That won't change at all. I was in the Senate, working in the Senate during the Gulf of Tonkin crisis with Gaylord Nelson, the founder of Earth Day. I was his legislative director. And then I worked on UN policy, very high level of the State Department. It was a special assistant. That system isn't going to change at all until we change ourselves. So what John is talking about, I totally agree. Unless you can rebuild from the community up, you don't get there. But unless you also deal with corporate power, you don't get there. So our foreign policy reflects who we are. And so what we're talking about here sounds like we're talking about community rebuilding and economic restructuring and regionalism and public ownership. And that is the precondition of altering the big picture. That doesn't mean we have to stop what we're doing to resist. And by God, they're going to spend $1 trillion rebuilding nuclear weapons now. $1 trillion. Yeah. That Obama launched that. And he's the guy in the White House now has added to that on the rebuilding nuclear weapons. That isn't going to change unless we build that movement again. And it's, it's high time that some kind of a powerful movement, but it's all grounded in reconstruction from the bottom up, community by community by community, with ideas, with how you deal with the system. There is a danger in community rebuilding. It can lose the big picture. And we really have to, as I love this Chinese phrase, walk on 2 legs, local and national at the same time.
Well, we also have to make sure that we don't let China become our enemy. I think that whoever's question, because the United States doesn't have a no first use policy.
I agree.
It's quite frightening when we're going, when it's feeling like we're going at each other, like it feels like Iraq all over again. And
Exactly.
that there's no reason for China to be our enemy. Matter of fact, some of the things we've been talking to today, I think they're trying to figure out at the same time, it'd be nice to be cooperating globally because of climate change, COVID. I mean, how many things have to tell us that we are all connected?
Totally, I agree totally.
Why would we escalate nuclear weapons? I think something people don't know about nuclear weapons is that 1 million people have died from the testing of nuclear weapons.
Is that the number?
Yes.
I didn't know that number, yeah.
I have an alert coming out this week about it. Because, there's so many things we don't know. And yesterday, Congress said no to a 10% cut in the Pentagon, but all polls show the people of America want that. So, we also have a stuck system in Washington where you are, Gar, and I know you work hard, but there's a conundrum in the whole, like what the people want and what they understand is culturally long is not getting enacted. So I'm going to go to this next question. Our economies and institutions have been created with the rationale of efficiency. They can do it better than communities and local economies. How can we take it back our communities and local and personal power with such a strong demand and desire for efficiency? And I think both of you, I'd like to hear from both of you on that one.
Let me say on the non-corporate side, but on the in the world of the professions where I am particularly been focused, they have created, by and large, the most inefficient way of doing things that we know. And we're masters at it. We spend almost double the amount of our GNP on something called healthcare, really should be called medical care, than most other countries. So hugely inefficient institutions are around us, and they're complaining about the community not doing its part, right? And so it seems to me that within that way of understanding our current situation, the issue is, how do communities do their part and begin the process that Gar is talking about? And I want to, Gar, add from our perspective, the corporate system and its efficiency, providing every function that makes life good, this is their proposition, that creates absolutely functionless local people, and that leaves them individuals. So the transfer of all functions of productivity to institutions and professions says that I have no collective role. I agree. So a part of the big system effect is to produce people who are consumers and clients rather than citizens and producers. And if I had to say where I think we are today locally, it is that individualism, the idea that I do not need to act collectively. I need to get income to solve my problems at the hands of corporations and professions, is very, very strong. And a lot of what we're trying to do is to say, here are things you can do. Here are the beginnings, but you got to act together. It won't happen otherwise. So I'm talking about the pretty primary issue. And I think individualism is clearly a way of thinking and being that is much, much stronger when you and I were young, Gar.
Yep.
And that's the result of an ever-growing dependence and belief in the idea that these systems and professions produce a good life. Mm-hmm. And so we think the struggle at the bottom is basic as, what can we do collectively? What is there that you can do if you connect and that would be meaningful? How would you like this community to raise its children, mm-hmm, rather than you spend your life bitching and moaning about the school?
Totally. I totally agree. I know. That unless you can reconstruct the democratic and a self-sustaining vision of who we are from the bottom up, you don't get there. But and here's the big button. This is the Schumacher button.
It's
and you better not. And some people go localist and they don't want to talk about anything else. No, you got to start in the community. The book I wrote, Making a Place for, how do you work then to the upper stuff too? Because they're going to get you at the pass. They'll come down, they'll get you at the pass. If you don't deal with them, they'll deal with you. The figures on, as you know, on healthcare, we are, what, 18% of the economy is wasted on healthcare, whereas the British do it at 8.5%.
Yeah,
Just about half. It's an
unbelievable.
outrageously inefficient system, waste in the corporations and the insurance people. And the healthcare is better on the whole for most, on average. Rich people don't have any problem with the healthcare they get.
Yeah, yeah.
We're in the I mean, I started community. If you can't do it in Racine, don't talk to me about it. But also let's go up to the top.
Yeah.
All right. Well, this has been lovely. I've enjoyed this and I've been inspired by it. And I think my last question is, you're so passionate and energized and creative and engaged, and you believe the more beautiful world is possible that we all desire. I mean, and you spend your days on it. What can you tell our audience about what keeps you going? What's the secret sauce? I think
John, you better start.
Right? And you're both in your 80s. Tell us the secret.
Yeah. When I was in the university, I had the best professor that I had while I was there. And he taught a strange subject called general semantics. But one of the things that he would say very often is, and it caught my ear and my mind, he said, for change to happen, you will have to have high motivation and low expectations. High motivation and low expectations. Because it's a struggle and you will lose off and on the way. And therefore, if losing defeats your motivation to change, then you're going to lose. So he said, don't have winning and high expectation as the driving force for what you do. The driving force should be your motivation for change. And so I got to be honest, I don't really think about the current situation in terms of what I do, because I never expected to have so much evil at the top of our system. But that does not change if you get into the habit of saying, I am about the business of change, and that's my role. I'm a citizen, and that's what I do. And I'm not going to allow myself to get stopped from a continuing struggle by the fact that things don't necessarily go my way.
Well, I have a somewhat similar and somewhat different take. I'm a historian and a political economist. I wear two hats. Economic systems come and go. If you stand back just about a little bit, you see worldwide change and revolutions and big reforms and new deals and overthrow populists. And so I don't take seriously the moment as I don't think that's reality. I think that's this moment.
Right.
And the question then becomes, and my heroes in this way, I really think about the Black activists in Mississippi in the 1930s.
Yeah.
They couldn't see any hope. They would more likely be strung up on a tree than achieve what they wanted to achieve. And yet, without them laying the groundwork, you would not have had the 60s.
Mm-hmm.
And another picture of that kind, which is also how you really cannot you read the tea leaves properly. I'm from Wisconsin, Racine, Wisconsin. When I went to school, Joe McCarthy was everywhere. They shot anything that moved. They shot anything that moved. And if you said we can do politics, even liberal civil rights and feminist and environmental, they'd say you're crazy. And of course, boom, the 60s blew up and Joe McCarthy was gone. So I don't take things, I don't read the tea leaves. I said, I agree with John. Get it, hang in there. Hang in. Lay the groundwork. Don't be distracted by people who say, well, that guy's going to get you. history has a lot of examples of change that look even much worse than what we're looking at. And then people move. They, as we used to say in the civil rights movement, we shall overcome.
Jodie, let me add, if I may. I have lived through 4, at least, national movements that grew from locality. The civil rights movement, in a way, exploded from the joint action and concern of small groups across this country, in local churches, in local unions, in local choirs. There's a wonderful history, this little light of mine, of the civil rights movement that I think shows that it is these small groups that made the civil rights movement. But the point is that I was working, my first job was in the field then called race relations, right? But there was no movement. And then after about 10 years, I was being swept along by a movement that made much more change than I had ever made with the people who were at work then. And then came along Wisconsin's Earth Day, and a movement called environmentalism came all of a sudden, but there were all kinds of groups who had worked on it and were ready and who came together as a movement. And then the same thing happened with women. And then the same thing happened in the gay and lesbian community. And so all I can say to anyone, and this is probably what is my greatest hope, I lived through 4 great movements that made major change, and I didn't see that they were there.
Right.
And all of a sudden they came. So what I know for sure, and is my greatest hope, is there's a movement under me that I just don't see right now. But just like the civil rights movement, all of a sudden it will become collected and visible and will create great policy change.
Yep.
So we've got a long history of success by little local stuff coming together and making big stuff.
You've both left us with, we need to engage locally because that will be part of the change. We must be citizens,
yeah,
and not passive, and take our power back. I want to thank Gar Alperovitz and John L. McKnight for all you do every day, for inspiring us. And this year marks the 40th anniversary of the E.F. Schumacher Lectures. And we hope you'll join us on October 25th for our first virtual lecture with George Monbiot of The Guardian in London and Callie Akuno of Cooperation Jackson, who can talk even more about what it is to create power locally. So thank you for joining us. Small is beautiful, and we live inside of a big system, so let's just be engaged. Thank you.
Thanks, Gar, for
and you too, John and Jodie.
Thank you so much.